The re-elected Albanese government is confronting major challenges in its second term. A housing crisis, accelerating climate change leading to more frequent and severe fires and floods, and growing inequality chief among them. But despite what we're often told, there is no shortage of solutions. The government only needs the courage to implement them.
One for mum, one for dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
Welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute podcast which explains economics, politics and policy in plain English. I'm Glenn Conley, Senior Media Advisor here at the Australia Institute. With a large majority in the lower house and a Labor-Greens majority in the Senate, the government has a generational opportunity to implement big reform. And at the National Press Club this week, the Prime Minister hinted at a bolder agenda than the one his party took to the election.
The commitments the Australian people voted for in May are the foundation of our mandate. They are not the limits of our responsibilities or of our vision.
This week on the show, we explore some bold ideas to change Australia for the better. We hear from four leading public policy thinkers, Richard Dennis, Maiy Azize, Polly Hemming and Thomas Mayo, about the lie that the market always knows best, why government is best placed to lead these bold changes, and why they're hopeful despite the big challenges we confront. The discussions are from our 12-part podcast series, What's the Big Idea? Hosted by former ABC broadcaster Paul Barclay, the episodes were recorded in the early months of 2025. One of the biggest roadblocks to change is the state of the policy debate. As Richard Dennis, Executive Director of the Australia Institute, explains, 25 million Australians won't all agree. But the false claims and outright lies that are peddled by vested interests are holding Australian democracy back.
My biggest aim is for us to have an honest conversation. An honest conversation. This sounds a bit grandiose, but you can't have good democracy without good, honest public debate about hard things. And we won't all agree. Right? 25 million Australians won't all agree on what the country should prioritise and what kind of things we should do more of. That's fine. Like I'm a Democrat. I will go along with not getting my way all the time. But what I can't go along with is people lying, flat out lying to the public's face to get what they want for the economy, what they want for their society, what they want. I'm not opposed to them making a claim for what they want. You know, if Australians want to have really low taxes and a really crap health system like America, well, I think that's a bad idea. And I will make all sorts of arguments, economic, historic and moral, for why I think that's a bad idea. But if we go and do it, okay, we can go and do it. But doing it because someone told us we had to do it that way, doing it because we got told that if we didn't do it that way, then the economy would go to hell in a handbasket and your kids will never get a job, well, no, I'm not having that. So to be as honest as I can, why do I want to talk about these things? One, because we can't have a good democracy if people are just going to lie about such important things. And two, I do have a preference for collecting a bit more tax from the fossil fuel industry and spending more of it on public health and public education. That's my preference. That's not my expertise. I can make economic arguments for it, but even if I wasn't an economist, my desire to live in that country is legitimate and I should be allowed to say it. But in Australia, we've kind of been trained that you're not allowed to say things like that because you haven't even got any economic modelling.
Not only that, you do realise how deeply embedded this idea about the fossil fuel industry being so important to the Australian economy is. I mean, even the way we view the Australian economy as a great big quarry where we dig out our natural resources, we export them overseas, and this is the reason we are so prosperous. It's actually a myth, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it absolutely is a myth. And just to be clear, we do dig up a lot of iron ore. We really do. It's a big number. And we do dig up a lot of coal. And we do drill for a lot of gas. We're the world's third largest fossil fuel exporter. Okay? Saudi Arabia 1, Russia 2, Australia 3. We export a lot of fossil fuels. That's true. Full stop. No debate. It's just not true that that's the major employer in Australia. It's just not true that despite the size of that, it's not true that that's what funds all of our schools and hospitals. It's just not true that if we didn't export so much gas, we'd go to hell in a handbasket. Because you know what? We didn't export much gas until 2015. I'm an old man, Paul. 2015 feels like yesterday. I've got unfinished projects that are older than that. I've got things on my to-do list from 2015 that I'm still chipping away on. And that's when we started to be one of the world's largest exporters of gas. So it's just not even historically true that we can't live without gas exports, because you know what? In 2014, we were living without gas exports. It's just silly, but it's said so loud. It's said so confidently. It's said so regularly. And it's said by so many people wearing such expansive suits in such prestigious ways and prestigious platforms that the people listening to this are thinking, oh, I like Richard, and that sounds about right. But it can't be quite right, because how could that many people lie to me?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, in relation to exports, and you remind us of this in your piece, that Australia has, for a variety of reasons over decades, consciously decided to either restrict or ban certain exports, despite the financial benefits they may have delivered to the companies doing the exporting. We've made decisions not to go ahead with those exports. Just remind us of some of those examples, Richard.
Oh, well, indeed. I mean, in my lifetime, feeling very old today, Paul, Australia was whaling. We were whaling in Western Australia. Once upon a time, whaling was big in Byron Bay and Ballina. And you know what? When we banned whaling, it was bad for the whaling industry. I promise you that banning whaling was bad for the whaling industry. I promise you that whalers lost their job. I promise you that the whalers didn't pay as much tax. But you know what? We decided that there were other ways to get oil and meat than killing an endangered species, so we stopped doing it. You know what the whalers said at the time? Oh, it's the end of the world. Oh, you'll ruin the economy. Oh, you'll ruin this town. Well, I don't want to ruin towns. I don't want to ruin people's lives, but I don't want whales to go extinct as well. And if we, as a nation state, one of the richest countries in the world, want to help unemployed whalers, we can do that in a heartbeat. Mm. And if we want to help people that lose their jobs in coal mines, we can do that in a heartbeat, because we're rich. But rather than say, oh, if Barry the coal miner lost his job, how could we help him? We're like, oh, if Richard gets his way, Barry will lose his job and then Barry will die in poverty. So the reason we have to cause climate change is Barry. But you know what the coal industry would do in a heartbeat? Sack Barry if they can get a robot truck. I don't hate Barry the coal miner. I've spent my life trying to say, hey, how's that going to affect workers? Hey, how's that going to affect disadvantaged groups? It's a bit sick to think that global fossil fuel companies are the only people that care about the workers in Australia, and elite Richard, whatever that means, in his ivory tower, which I don't work in, I work at a not-for-profit think tank, he doesn't care about. So whaling, asbestos. Remember the good old days when we mined asbestos? Remember James Hardy? Remember the Hardy-Ferodo car race? All that asbestos, creating all those jobs and all those exports. We stopped that. Why? Because it was killing people. And just recently, we just banned, rightly, these composite stone bench tops that people put in their kitchens, because the workers who install them are inhaling dangerous dust and it ruins their lungs and kills them. But you know what the stone benchtop industry said when we said, well, how about we stop that dangerous product for which there's a million alternatives? Oh, but you're going to destroy the economy and ruin jobs. And what about people's choice in kitchens? So it's just sick. If slavery was good for the economy, would we do it? No, that's not how democracies work.
Nowhere are the failures of the market and Australian public policy more obvious than in housing. And the impact of these failures isn't theoretical. as Maiy Azize, national spokesperson for the Everybody's Home campaign and Deputy Director of Anglicare Australia, explains. Australia's housing affordability crisis is affecting real people right now. But the good news is that government can step in to fix it. In fact, it's done so before.
I find this such an overwhelming question because people are affected in so many different ways. Our campaign hears from people who are on the really extreme side of the housing crisis, people who are doing things like sleeping in cars, sleeping in tents, people who have been evicted, can't afford a rental and just have no idea what to do and no idea what to tell their children about, what's going to happen and where they're going. Those are the really extreme stories. But there are also much more everyday stories. We held something called a People's Commission. We held a People's Commission into Australia's housing crisis last year. And some of the most common stories that we heard were people just having to move about once a year because they were served with these huge rent increases and they couldn't afford to keep up with them. We heard from people who had moved. We heard from one family, actually, who had moved 7 times in 7 years. And the woman, Lucy, who was telling us this story, was saying that she had just found a rental that was pretty far away from where they'd been living, so her kids were going to have to change schools. Every year they had been moving, and she said to her kids when they arrived at this new rental, right, we're finally home. This is where we're going to live. And her kids didn't even believe her because they were so used to moving so constantly. So there's all sorts of different ways that this problem is affecting people, from really unthinkable ways, where people can't even get their life going, really. If you're living in a car, there's so many things that you can't do and you're just locked out of permanently, through to these more everyday effects.
Yeah, some of these people are people with full-time jobs who can't afford to rent a house, often in the regional areas that they're living in, and they're living in tents and caravans.
Yeah, that's right. You mentioned the essential worker research that we did a couple of years ago. We actually had a report that just came out a couple of days ago, which looked at people who were on incomes between 40,000 and 130,000. So 40,000 a year, 50, 60, 70, all the way up to 130,000. And I think we can all agree, if you're earning $130,000 a year, you're pretty comfortable. But we found that in capital cities around the country, you basically have to be earning $130,000 a year to keep your housing costs under 30%, which is pretty insane. In many parts of the country, you have to be earning $100,000 a year just to afford the average rent and keep it under 50% of your income.
Yeah.
So it's pretty dire.
Look, I'm a journalist. I've been around for a while. I've been reporting on housing for an extremely long time. And despite all the talk of the great Australian dream slipping away, and the great Australian dream seems to have been slipping away for decades now, notwithstanding the fact that it is extremely bad at the moment. Despite this, despite governments pledging action, despite the media being obsessed really with real estate and housing prices and interest rates, despite all of that, the perception is things are not improving. Is that a fair perception? And if it is, why aren't they improving?
It's absolutely true that things aren't improving. Things are getting worse all the time. And it's really accelerated in the past couple of years. You look at rents and house prices since the pandemic started, the COVID pandemic started, and things have only gotten worse and they haven't really improved. You get one quarter in Australia where rents maybe don't grow as much as they did in the previous quarter, and every commentator suddenly goes up in arms and says, oh my God, everything is slowing down, which is pretty insane as it is, this idea that you can expect, baked in rental growth at astronomical rates quarter after quarter, and anything less than that is quote unquote slowing down is pretty mental. But the fact is, the government has almost no footprint in this area. Its footprint in this area is getting smaller and not getting bigger. And as a direct result of that, we're seeing the situation get worse as we become more and more dependent on the private market.
Is the private market and adjustments to the private market, adjustments to incentives in the private market, is that going to get us out of this crisis, or do we need to look at this in an entirely different way? Because at the moment, all of the solutions, to the extent that they exist, proposed solutions, are about market mechanisms. Is there another way?
There is another way, and we've done it before. And the good news there, this is the thing that makes me really optimistic. Everything we have ever needed to do in Australia to fix the housing crisis has been done here in this country before. The only difference today is that we are a richer country than we've ever been. So we can do it again. The government built social housing from the ground up. It used to build 30,000 homes a year pretty consistently for a long time. We can go back to doing that. There is no reason we can't go back to that. I'm a little bit allergic to, quote unquote, innovative solutions. I speak at a lot of events and speak to a lot of journalists, and everybody wants to ask me about tiny homes on wheels and, all sorts of things that are actually pretty niche. These things might be helpful on a small scale, but they aren't going to end the crisis writ large. Only the government can do that by changing the tax system that we've got, because we've really got the wrong people in Australia supplying housing. We are extremely dependent on hobby investors to supply what is really an essential service. I think everyone would agree housing is an essential service and an essential public good. And at the same time, we've got the government stepping further and further away. I think it really suits them to have a narrative where all they need to do in this space is make it possible for the private sector to build more and then blame other levels of government when that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
I think that's a version of the story that really works for them. And I think a challenge for a campaign like ours, like the Everybody's Home campaign, is to change that story and put more pressure on them to do more.
Together we can end the climate wars. Together, we can take advantage of the opportunity for Australia to be a renewable energy superpower.
In 2022, the Albanese government came to power promising to take decisive action to address climate change. Since then, we've seen some progress on investment in renewable energy. But throughout its first term, the government continued to approve new coal and gas projects. And in the first weeks of its second term, new Environment Minister Murray Watt, who replaced Tanya Plibersek for the new term, approved a 50-year extension to the biggest fossil fuel project in the country. In fact, one of the biggest in the world, Woodside's climate-destroying Northwest Shelf gas export project. Polly Hemming is Director of the Climate and Energy Program at the Australia Institute. As she explains, doing some good things doesn't make up for continuing to do bad ones. And while governments get caught up in complicated market mechanisms and bogus offset schemes, the best solutions are often the simplest ones.
I think caution characterises progressive politics, and I think that fear comes from being accused of economic recklessness or fiscal negligence, and a fear that has come about as a result of the past. You 75% of Australians, for example, want a polluter pays tax in Australia, which is basically a carbon tax. But there's no way anyone in Australia is going to use the words carbon tax, even though it's good policy and it's bold policy. It's sensible policy. So I think there is that fear, but at the same time, I think Australians are afflicted by not wanting to have a fight. No one wants to have a fight, or the people that do want to have a fight are usually crazy. Humans are naturally conflict averse, whether it's in politics or in our daily lives. And there's a real distaste for conflict. Even debating ideas is now being conflated with personal attacks. And I think the irony is, as our nation's prosperity is increased, complacency and caution has taken the place of boldness and bravery and a willingness to fight out an idea. And that's with good reason, like with the intensification of neoliberalism, which is neoliberalism and authoritarianism, I'd say, in Australia over the last 30 years. Our leaders, increasingly scared themselves, which is what I was referring to before, have taught Australians to be scared. Think about how well fear is such a powerful motivator. You should be scared of power, scared of refugees, scared of losing franking credits, even if you don't know what franking credits are. Scared of wind farms, scared of African gangs, scared of being put in jail for being a whistleblower, and overwhelmingly, I think, scared that more for others means less for us. If we were to help out those dole bludgers, if we were to increase welfare, well, that's taking money away from good, hardworking people. And I'm saying that in inverted commas, I should say. And actually, it's the greatest threats are not those things. It's the fear, incrementalism, and low expectations. And I think that aversion to discomfort or conflict that are the greatest threat to all of us.
Well, yes, the fear that was able to be whipped up over a non-binding advisory committee for Indigenous Australians, for example. Vastly disproportionate amount of fear that was able to be constructed relative to what the actual proposal was. You often hear it said that we can't afford to do this. We can't afford universal dental care. We can't afford free university education. In Victoria at the moment, some are saying we can't afford the new suburban rail link. All of these are examples that I'd have thought are popular. How much of a constraint is money or debt on doing the right thing, on good policy?
Well, it was Josh Frydenberg who said anything's affordable if it's a priority. And that was in relation to spending, how many hundreds of billions of dollars on submarines. Australia is the world's 13th largest economy. We've got a GDP about the size of Russia's. Yeah, we're spending $400 billion on submarines we'll probably never get. Our funding for defence war toys will reach about $760 billion over this decade. The idea that we don't have money is ridiculous. We have so much money, yet we have kids, as I said, we have kids living in tents in Australia. When our governments say they can't afford things, it just means they don't want to spend the money on them. To use the environment as an example. So Australia is in a pretty bad place when it comes to its environmental track record, and our ecosystems are officially deteriorating and in decline. That was in the State of the Environment report. The cost of restoring and protecting the environment has been placed variously at $2 billion a year. One estimate, it puts it at $16 billion a year. This is not a lot when you consider that state and federal governments spend $14 billion in the last year on fossil fuel subsidies. $10 billion a year goes to the actual things causing ecosystem collapse. And the current government, Environment Minister Tanya Plibersek, has said we can't afford to restore and protect the environment alone, and has opened it up to the private sector has to step in, and we need markets to help do this. But there's a strong irony in the government claiming it can't afford to fund conservation without private capital, while it's directly subsidising the expansion of industries like gas and coal, which are contributing to the climate and biodiversity crisis.
So, I'm trying to think here of what the barriers might be toward courageous policy, or what governments might argue the barriers are. Are the solutions to climate change, inequality, our other major problems, are they simply too complex? Is that a barrier to action?
It's funny you say that. We're always told that the most obvious policy solutions are naive and wildly unrealistic, and that it will take time to reduce emissions and turn this big cruise ship around. We actually don't have time. The physics isn't going to wait. We're told we can't afford to spend money, and how critical certain industries are to our economy, to regional security. And then we're led to believe that when it comes to climate, the solutions lie in these really elaborate and innovative profit-maximising financing mechanisms that no one ever really understands, and you never question stuff that you don't understand. But there's never any discussion of just, we're going to stop doing the bad stuff. And that's what it comes down to.
So you're referring there, I think, to the whole offset rort, if I can use that term, whereby you continue to emit CO2 into the atmosphere, but you offset it in a kind of accounting way by saying that, we're still emitting carbon to keep all of these factories going and to keep the Australian economy ticking over, but it's okay because we're protecting these tracts of rainforest in Indonesia, and all of those trees act as a sink that sucks in all of the carbon that we've pumped into the environment. But as you know, because you've done a lot of research in this, that's not actually what's happening at all.
Yeah, that's a really good example. That's one of those things where we don't even need to have a conversation about ending fossil fuels, because we can have a great conversation about markets and offsets. And this is a really complicated, opaque mechanism to distract from ending fossil fuels. Carbon capture and storage is another one, all sorts of technocratic solutions and markets and stuff, but it's actually not complicated. Stop doing bad stuff. Our governments know this. You mentioned whaling before. It was stopped in most of the world because it was cruel and unnecessary. Bob Hawke just said we're not going to mine Antarctica. So there's a lot of excuses made, and things are made really complicated, and humans actually have this kind of little glitch in their brain where we prefer the most complicated solution to things. I can't remember the name of it now, but we always opt for the most complicated solution because it just couldn't be as simple as ending fossil fuel subsidies. It actually is.
The challenges facing Australia can feel overwhelming, and sometimes each step forward feels like it's followed by 2 steps back. The defeat of the referendum to establish a constitutionally enshrined Indigenous voice to Parliament was a bitter blow to those who've been fighting for reconciliation. Thomas Mayo was a leading figure in the Voice referendum and is Assistant National Secretary of the Maritime Union of Australia. He explains why, despite the 60-40 defeat of the Yes campaign, he's still hopeful and fighting for change.
Yeah, the Uluru Statement continues to be probably the most, powerful and eloquent pieces of writing it's just such a moving thing still, and no less truthful about our past and our present and where we need to go. So I encourage people to continue to share it. As you mentioned, not a lot of Australians. There's still a lot of Australians that haven't read the Uluru Statement or aren't aware of it. It's one of the ways to help people to become familiar. I think a lot of people were inspired to support the campaign just on the basis of feeling what that said.
Just finally, Thomas, how are you remaining optimistic after after the referendum defeat and the difficulties that you've spoken of? You remain committed, obviously, but how do you remain optimistic?
Well, we talked about the hateful messages and type of things that I get, but I'll share this in the entire time. In this entire time, I've only been abused on the street twice. Otherwise, it's been so much more love than hate, and I think social media, in many ways, one of the tactics of the far right and those bad actors is to take away our hope, so that we give up and that we don't bother trying to make progress on the things that matter to ordinary people. And so social media makes us think that there's so much more hate out there as well. I reckon that we've just got to resist that and just keep talking with each other. Keep organising, keep joining groups, get more political, and that's the pathway to getting these things done.
That's where we'll leave it for today's episode of Follow the Money. Thanks so much for joining me. You can find the What's the Big Idea series via the link in the show notes or wherever you get your podcasts. New episodes drop every Monday morning until mid-July. If you like the work we do here at the Australia Institute, please consider supporting our end of financial year appeal. By donating today, you'll help fund the research changing Australia for the better. All donations over $2 are tax deductible, and you can do so by following the link in the show notes. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Glenn Conley. Thanks for listening.